Perfect. Great, so we are at 32 attendees and we are expecting around 60 people registered for today's webinar, so let's get started. My name is Kelsey Lane. I'm the Senior Transportation Coordinator here at the Ecology Action Center, and I'm joined here today with Mo Cabrera and Jeff Turner from Dunsky Consulting. I'm going to begin with a quick presentation from the Ecology Action Center to orient us in the context of this report. Fantastic. Great. So it is a beautiful day here in Halifax, and it's 4 p.m. on a Friday. So we truly appreciate everyone that has made the time to be here and for your interest in electric vehicle adoption in Nova Scotia. We are beyond pleased to be able to release this report, and commissioned by the Ecology Action Center and prepared by Dunsky Energy Consulting. We have with us again 2 consultants here today from Dunsky who will be presenting the technical aspects of the report. But from the Ecology Action Center, we did just want to contextualize the report and provide a little bit of background for why we think the release of this white paper is so important in the current context. So firstly, the relevant policy that backs up this report. We have the Pan-Canadian framework that had the 30% of GHG reduction goals below the 2005 levels. Here locally in Nova Scotia, the Sustainable Development Goals Act had a goal of 53% reduction below 2005 levels. And then just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Halifax Regional Municipality released their climate action plan, which is one of the most ambitious in the country, with a 75% reduction of GHG below 2005 levels by 2030. So certainly the GHG landscape and the reductions that we need to achieve by 2030 is a good justification for focusing on the transportation sector. And also notably, the pace at which we have to decarbonize is significant as well. The majority of reductions need to happen between now and 2030. And in the context of transportation, we know that around 28 to 32% of emissions in Nova Scotia are from that sector. 54% are from the personal vehicle sector. So certainly we're looking at the GHG perspective. We know that's important, but also notably in 2018, the Ecology Action Center commissioned a report that focused on 5 goals that we wanted to see in the Sustainable Development Goals Act. And one of them was reducing car dependence and electrifying the personal public transportation sector. We weren't just focusing on the GHG reduction goals, we were focusing on the economic and cost benefits of achieving this as well. And certainly in Nova Scotia, we find those are very significant. And then lastly, just the federal government had announced their zero emission vehicle sales targets, 10% by 2025, 30% by 2030, and 100% by 2040. So with this white paper, we have our why. We know why electrification of the personal transportation sector and the light duty sector is so important. But the question that we are left with is how? How are we going to achieve that? We know the importance of that 2030 target. What will it take in Nova Scotia to achieve that? So when we were framing up and developing the objectives of the white paper, we wanted to explore the current electric vehicle landscape. What are the opportunities, what's already being done, and what are the barriers that could prevent us from achieving those objectives? Secondly, we wanted to identify policy levers that have worked in other places that could be applicable here, and what that would do to accelerate electric vehicle adoption in Nova Scotia. And then finally, we wanted to quantify it. We wanted to know what those numbers would look like. We wanted to know what that would mean in terms of how many vehicles were achievable by that 2030 landmark if all of these policy levers were pulled. And so we were very pleased and very fortunate to be able to work with Dunsky Consulting to frame up this white paper and also have them complete the background and the research for this. So without much further ado, I'll present Mo Cabrera and Jeff Turner to present the details of this report. And there will be, we will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll have a time at the end to have a question and answer period with the consultants and myself. Thank you so much. And I will turn it over to you, Mo. And that's a very clean desktop, Mo. I'm impressed.
Mo, I think you're still on mute.
Thanks, Kelsey. I think it's my secondary desktop, so I know. But my main one is pretty clean too. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. My name is Mo Kabara. I'm joined here by my colleague Jeff Turner, and we're part of Dunsky Energy Consulting. Dunsky Energy Consulting is one of the leading Canadian firms specializing in clean energy consulting. We have our three areas of expertise: energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean mobility. And within that, we specialize in the design, evaluation, and analytical support for leading clean energy and electric mobility initiatives across North America. This is just a snapshot of our clients across North America and who we worked for. And really, our services are focused on quantifying what's possible, helping those clients, design strategies to achieve that, and then evaluating those strategies to help them get more out of it in the future. So we're here today to present our study that we conducted for the Ecology Action Center, and the study was focused on EV adoption in the province of Nova Scotia. So quick overview of the presentation today. We'll be looking at what the scope was, a little bit of a snapshot of Nova Scotia's current EV market. Then we'll look at the policy toolkit, some of the policy levers that can be used for accelerating adoption of EVs. Specifically, we'll dive a little bit deeper on incentives and ZEV mandate. And then we'll look at our analysis. We'll introduce the model, our model, proprietary model that we've used. We'll look at the scenarios that we've modeled. We'll look at the results of those modeling, that modeling. And then we'll talk a little bit high level in terms of societal impacts. And then we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways and considerations. And we'll have Q&A and discussion after that. So I'll start off by just reiterating that, the Ecology Action Center was looking at the how, and we were we were retained by them to help them, figure that out. And one of the things that we looked at first is really taking the snapshot and understanding the local context of the EV market in Nova Scotia. We then looked at the policy levers that are applicable to the province and evaluated them qualitatively, and looked at various metrics of evaluation that I'll discuss later. And then we actually did quantify two of those levers, one being a provincial EV purchase incentive, specifically one that can help with that first cost barrier. So it's an upfront purchase incentive for low and middle income families. And then we also looked at zero emission vehicle mandate that will help alleviate the supply constraints on the market. So to start off, Jeff is going to walk us through the current landscape in Nova Scotia.
Great, thanks, Mo. So I think many of you on the call are probably pretty familiar with the EV landscape here in Nova Scotia, but I think it's important just to sort of lay this out for everyone on the line. Just to start, I mean, I think we all recognize that we've made some progress. We now have a few hundred EVs on the road in Nova Scotia, but we have a long way to go. And in particular, I think you can see on the graphs on the right side, comparing EV adoption across all 10 provinces, you can see it was necessary to break this out onto two different scales, just because what we've seen so far in Nova Scotia and a number of their provinces is just orders of magnitude away from what's been accomplished so far in BC, Quebec, and Ontario. And in particular, these are the three provinces that have at least at some point, introduced very supportive policies like purchase incentives or even ZEV mandates. In the case of Ontario, of course, I think a lot of you probably saw that during the last provincial election or immediately afterwards, the previous financial incentive program for EVs was canceled abruptly. This is never something that we would recommend. I think we'll talk about our approach to phasing out incentives gradually. But even so, I think we can see that those kinds of efforts to incentivize new technologies at early stages in the market can really help build some momentum so that even when those policies are pulled back, these jurisdictions are still further out ahead thanks to that kickstart that we give to the market. So that's certainly one of the key barriers in Nova Scotia, the fact that we haven't seen that kind of a policy or that kind of a incentive come down at the provincial level. Meanwhile, we've seen very good progress in Nova Scotia in terms of charging infrastructure, especially public fast charging infrastructure, thanks to investments from Nova Scotia Power and Enercan. So we're now at a point where the early adopters in Nova Scotia can get more or less anywhere in the province and count on fast charging stations along key corridors. That said, as we've seen in many other jurisdictions, there's still a need for ongoing investment in this space, both as the capabilities of EVs increase, and we're looking at charging capabilities that can charge cars in less than half an hour or even 15 minutes. But also as the EV population grows, it becomes important to make sure that this charging infrastructure has sufficient capacity to handle a large volume of vehicles traveling on peak travel days. We've also seen really good progress on the consumer awareness front in the past year with the Next Ride initiative, for example. And so this is great. We've seen success on this in other jurisdictions, really helpful to get folks behind the wheel of an EV and actually see what these things are like to drive. So really good progress on that front. But I think what's frustrating to both potential EV adopters and the organizations responsible for some of these early successes is that we're still seeing a severe lack of availability of EVs in dealerships in Nova Scotia. Separately to this study, we've been doing some work with the federal government tracking availability of EVs in dealerships across Canada. And through that study, we found that earlier this year, only 1 in 10 dealerships in Nova Scotia had at least one EV available for purchase. So there's a lot of discussion about, what comes first, supply or demand for a new technology, but it's hard to argue that we can have a true sense of demand for technology if those who are interested in buying one would have such a hard time actually tracking one down. So that provides some of the context for exactly why we wanted to dive into some of the specific policy measures that we'll be talking about in the rest of this presentation. I'll pass it back to you, Mo.
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, there were already some initiatives on the ground in Nova Scotia, and we wanted to understand, some of the policy levers that are important for moving the needle forward and moving the market forward in the province. So we conducted what we call a qualitative assessment of these policy levers. You can see here, they're categorized based on public charging, home charging, education, financial incentives, non-financial incentives, and supply side policies. We came into this really with a focus on financial incentives and supply side policies, or specifically ZEV mandate, but we wanted to have a better understanding qualitatively of how other levers are also compared against the ones that we're focused on, specifically when it comes to the impact on adoption, the need for provincial incentives, and the last one being implementation cost. And really the key thing that we got out of this exercise was that our qualitative assessment really reiterated and assured us that a financial incentive as ZEV mandate will have a high impact on adoption, is likely to have a high impact on adoption in the province. There's also not a whole lot of other players that could actually intervene to implement those levers, specifically showing that there's a strong need for a provincial intervention for incentives and for ZEV mandate. While the focus of the study was not really on, public charging and, charging at homes in MURBs and multi-residential buildings, we recognize that there is work to be done in the future on this, and Jeff can elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, and I think I already mentioned this a bit, but I think we wanted to just make clear that, by focusing on the ZEV mandate and financial incentives for this project, we're by no means saying that mission accomplished on the charging infrastructure front. As I mentioned, there's an ongoing need for investment in this space, and I talked about fast charging earlier, but also on the multi-unit residential front. By far the most convenient place to charge a vehicle is at home, and for those living in apartments and condos, this can be a major barrier to adoption. So there's a strong need for intervention, both in terms of requirements for new buildings, but also in retrofits for the existing building stock. But again, that's not really the focus of this study.
So basically, what helped us evaluate these metrics against the levers, we had a stakeholder engagement as part of the as part of our methodology and as part of the study. And some of the key things that we've heard, was that vehicle inventory and the supply of EVs is one of the major challenges in the province today. There's month-long wait times or complete unavailability of some popular models that consumers want. That could be for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that was highlighted was that dealerships are actually having a hard time justifying getting into EVs because of high costs of tooling and service maintenance and training, and even installation of fast chargers on the lot. So being a high cost investment for them as well. Another thing being that Nova Scotia is not being prioritized, and we're in Canada. We have a ZEV mandate in BC and Quebec, and OEMs are prioritizing those jurisdictions where they're actually mandated to sell EVs, whereas Nova Scotia is not really being prioritized at the moment. And one key thing that we've heard from all stakeholders is that ZEV mandate, as a supply side policy would be important, but it must really be accompanied by demand side policies such as incentives. So those two are, the coupling of those two is really important in terms of moving policies on EVs forward. And that is why, we took a little bit of a deep dive on financial incentives, both in modeling, but also looking at other jurisdictions. Here we see this graph showing all the countries that have, an incentive or a purchase subsidy for EV. And then we can really see, the range there all the way from $2,000 to $14,500 in Singapore. And one of the key things here to highlight is that 90% of global EV sales are happening in those countries, are happening in countries where there is a direct purchase subsidy. The trend in Canada is not that different. As mentioned earlier, Quebec and BC are the leading jurisdictions, and even Ontario, that had an incentive at one point, is the third there in terms of cumulative EV sales, really highlighting the importance of provincial incentives on top of a federal incentive to really move the needle forward. So there's definitely been a good start in terms of a federal incentive that has helped, but I think most jurisdictions here that we'll highlight in terms of provincial or state will have that as an addition to the federal incentive. So here, we'll look at some of the ZEV mandate states in the U.S. All those ZEV jurisdictions are offering financial incentives on top of the federal tax credit in the U.S. and then the federal incentive in Canada. So here to talk about a ZEV mandate, really, a ZEV mandate requires automakers to sell a certain number of electric vehicles based on their overall vehicle sales in that jurisdiction. This is not something that is just exclusive to California, even though we hear about California a lot when it comes to ZEV mandate. It's something that has been adopted by 14 jurisdictions across North America, 12 states and 2 provinces in Canada. And most recently, it was actually adopted by Colorado with support from the automotive industry, which was kind of an unprecedented move there. Even GM has called for a national ZEV mandate, shifting really the narrative there, or shifting the position of automakers from very, very strong resistance to kind of coming along and maybe getting a little bit more supportive of such policies. And one thing to highlight too is that Nova Scotia is not that dissimilar from some states like Maine, Rhode Island, Vermont, in terms of vehicle size. The size of those states did not really stop them from implementing a ZEV mandate. Another thing to highlight here is that California is also moving in terms of the ZEV mandate on medium and heavy duty vehicles. And a bunch of other states are also looking at that now that California has implemented or passed its medium and heavy duty ZEV mandate. So now we wanted to kind of walk you through our analysis, and Jeff will start by introducing our proprietary EV adoption model.
Great, thanks, Mo. So yeah, for us to get a sense, and actually, I was just looking at the questions coming in. Lucas, I saw your question, both reinforcing that point about ongoing investment needed for fast charging, but also your question about our assessment that a financial incentive will drive adoption further. Actually, Mo, can you just go back again? I'm going to talk through the model. So our analysis here is not just, us taking a stab at what we think is going to move the market. We base this analysis on a model that we've put together over the past 3 years to really be scientific about this and take all of the research that we've done and that others have done in this field and pull those together into a model that lets us really be systematic about forecasting EV adoption and also forecasting the impact of various strategies for accelerating EV adoption beyond that baseline. So this is just a quick view of the dashboard of our model. In this case, we were focused on personal light-duty vehicles, but we've also done projects more focused on commercial, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles as well. But yeah, in all cases, it helps us to really work with clients that are trying to understand their best options for moving the needle on EV adoption. And not only that, but we can also take into account some more global factors that our clients might not have any control over, things like energy prices and battery costs, forecasts, and things like that. But we can take all those into account and really give our clients a sense of what's likely to happen over the next, say, 10 to 15 years for a typical project. So yeah, and then on the next slide, we'll just walk through to give you a sense of what's accounted for in this model and how it works. We break the analysis down into 4 sections. And actually, Mo, can you just move on to the next slide? The 4 sections that we use to assess potential, this is sort of our way of breaking down the analysis to account for a range of different inputs and factors that impact adoption, beginning with the overall technical potential for EV adoption. And by this, we mean the overall market size in a given jurisdiction. What is the number of vehicles in circulation? What is the rate of annual sales of new vehicles? And with that broken down into vehicle categories. So in this case, we are focused on light-duty vehicles, and we included 3 categories: passenger cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks. And crucially, I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard about, we're all looking at news headlines about the first plug-in pickup trucks that are going to hit the market. This is where we take those inputs into account, because of course, if we're to forecast adoption in 2020, if a certain portion of the market prefers pickup trucks, they're out of luck this year, and probably at least for the next year or so while we're waiting for some of these first models to hit the market. And we also take into account, just having 1 or 2 models that might be sufficient for an early adopter, but for broader mainstream adoption, we really need to see a broad diversity of models available in each category. And crucially, as I mentioned earlier, this is also where we take into account whether those models are accessible within the Nova Scotia market and whether they're available at local dealerships. The next section of the model focuses more on the economics. So this is where we look at the overall cost of either of an EV. And just a good moment to point out that when we talk about an EV, we mean really both battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. And sorry, there's a bit of a typo in this slide that I hadn't noticed until now. But for both those categories, we look at the incremental cost of those vehicles versus a conventional vehicle, and also the potential for savings over the life of that vehicle. So both in terms of energy costs and maintenance and other savings. And crucially, we consider the degree to which different types of purchasers weigh those 2 different costs. And for the most part, personal vehicle purchases, there's a lot of importance put on that upfront cost, even if an EV might save you money in the long run. We also account for some EV specific constraints, and this is where we're really thinking about things like range limitations and at the same time, the increase in range capabilities of new EV models. And complementary to that is deployment of charging infrastructure to support EVs driving on longer distances. So there are a couple different ways for us to account for charging infrastructure. One is that geographic connectivity, making sure that we've got a sufficient, we've connected the dots across a given jurisdiction, but also in terms of the capacity of that charging infrastructure. So to Lucas's question, we're talking about the number of cars that can be charged at one time and how quickly those cars can be charged, whether it's at 50 kilowatts or increasingly we're seeing 150 kilowatt and higher that can really shorten charge times. And also, of course, more important than any of the public charging infrastructure is making sure people can have access to charging at home. So we take all that into account in this portion of the model. And finally, the last section of the model, what we call the market component, is where we look at the market dynamics and how new technologies diffuse into a new population. Really looking at that classic S curve of adoption as we move from early adopters that are eager to adopt new technologies to those more mainstream consumers that are eager to see the technology out in the road and really benefit from that exposure over time before it sort of diffuses throughout the population. And crucially, this is also where we consider the fact that both plug-in hybrids and battery electrics, to a certain extent anyways, compete over some of the same market, and trying to understand how people might lean towards one option or another, and which of the constraints we discussed above apply to each of those types of vehicles. So on the next slide, just to highlight, this isn't the first time we've used this model. We first put this together about 3 years ago, and we've actually been using this in just about every province in Canada so far, as well as some work with the federal government. In many cases, these are clients that have asked us to help forecast the likely adoption of EVs. Sometimes this is with electric utilities, trying to understand what role they can play in accelerating adoption, or potentially trying to understand what is the impact of EVs on their grid. But in all cases, this is where we've had to, across a large number of projects, we've had to consider a wide range of factors that can impact EV adoption, and had the chance to really review the outputs of our model with a broad range of experts across the country who are heavily involved in this space. And so yeah, with that, I'll pass it back to you, Mo, and we can talk more specifically about the analysis we did for this project.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. So back to the modeling here. These are the scenarios that we modeled. So first, we started with a baseline scenario with the current federal incentive, assuming a phase out until 2025 being the last year, and keeping that constraint on supply assuming no ZEV mandate. The moderate scenario here is having a provincial incentive matching the federal incentive. So basically $5,000 incentive for a plug-in hybrid, a $10,000 incentive for a BEV, and basically assuming a ramp down over time with a final year of incentive in 2030, but also keeping that constraint on the supply. And then the last one being our high adoption scenario, which is under a ZEV mandate and provincial incentive coupled. With the same incentive as the moderate scenario, but the difference here is that we have a ZEV mandate, which will help alleviate that supply constraint. All scenarios are assuming the same level of infrastructure in terms of fast charging and also regular level 2 until 2030. So we're also assuming a certain level of adoption, or implementation of infrastructure from now until 2030. So this is. These are our results that everyone here has been waiting for. For our baseline scenario, we see that the trend is moving forward. The adoption is going to increase from the 0.3% that we have today. However, by 2030, Nova Scotia is still behind the federal ZEV target by quite a bit. So it's at 13%. More than half of what the federal ZEV target is, which is 30% by 2030. Basically we see growth, but it's slow growth for the EV market in Nova Scotia. The addition of provincial incentives will help. They will accelerate the uptake of EVs, but we see that it's still below that federal ZEV target, both in the short term by 2025 and in the long term by 2030. We see now the third scenario, which is the ZEV mandate, playing a big role, especially in that short term, helping alleviate that constraint, while jurisdictions are kind of fighting over supply, fighting over models. We see an increase by 265% relatively to the baseline in 2025, but we also see that we're exceeding the 30% federal ZEV target by 2030, with around 65,000 EVs on the road in Nova Scotia, relatively to a third of that in the baseline scenario. So qualitatively, we wanted to kind of address some higher level societal impacts other than just putting EVs on the road. What does that actually mean? There's a lot of potential for emission reductions, both at the tailpipe end and also the upstream through the value chain of gasoline. You know, the potential for EVs to reduce emissions in Nova Scotia is only going to be increasing as Nova Scotia decarbonizes its grid and its electricity mix. So there's a lot of benefits there that can be realized over the next decade. In terms of cost savings, you know, EVs, as mentioned earlier, you know, they bring a lot of cost savings to consumers from, you know, maintenance costs, but also fuel costs. You know, this is just an example of for somebody driving 20,000 kilometers in Quebec, you know, can save up to $1,600 a year. And there's a lot of benefits that can come from that to Nova Scotians, both households and businesses. In terms of ratepayer benefits for utilities, you know, the increase of electricity sales, you know, can help utilities increase their revenue and can result in cost savings for the ratepayers, especially and most importantly, if it's coupled with smart charging that can really reduce that impact of high peaks from EV charging and can really basically maximize the benefits and reduce the costs for utilities. And lastly, we have, you know, health benefits being a very important thing when it comes to air quality. You know, vehicle traffic is a very important, significant contributor to air pollution in urban areas. A recent study done in Toronto looked at the health benefits from EVs and looked at specifically, you know, premature deaths from poor air quality. And, you know, the deduction there was that a shift to electric vehicles would definitely result in reduction in air quality and also reduction in premature deaths that are directly caused by the poor air qualities in those areas. So key takeaways here for us, you know, we see that the baseline scenario that we highlighted, you know, will contribute to an increase in adoption of EVs, but, you know, but it's clear that, you know, a joint provincial and federal effort is going to be needed to bring Nova Scotia to that 30%. Provincial incentives are going to help, you know, but they're not sufficient to meet the 2030 federal ZEF target. The introduction of that incentive, you know, we see that wider adoption is going to remain limited due to the lagging availability of electric vehicle supply. And this is where the ZEV mandate scenario combined with provincial incentives will be critical to getting Nova Scotia to 30%. You know, we see there that, you know, despite adoption right now being quite low, you know, we have the potential to bring Nova Scotia to over 30% of sales by putting more than 60,000 vehicles on the road by 2030 under that scenario. And lastly here, as mentioned earlier, that we do assume that there's going to be, or there needs to be, continued investment in public infrastructure, you know, and favorable market conditions that will help achieve the high market forecast that we predict in this study. And with that, I can open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Mo and Jeff, for that wonderful presentation. And it's been a pleasure working with you on the study over the past number of months. So your expertise is certainly appreciated throughout the whole process. I also wanted to take this moment just to thank those that contributed to the study, whether through a phone call or just qualitatively through some of the data. We really appreciate your support and input there. And finally, to the Trottier Foundation for their generous donation that allowed us to be able to commission this study, along with those donors of the Ecology Action Center who have supported the transportation team over the past number of years. So I did want to pivot a little bit and shift over to the questions that we've received in the chat so far. I'm going to, if they're kind of been answered already, if there's a couple we can answer at the same time, I'll manage that. But the first question that we had was from Lucas Swan, and it was just to reiterate, why do you think a provincial purchase incentive will shift the EV sales? We have a federal incentive, and did that cause a huge bump in sales? And why do we think a provincial incentive will have that same effect?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lucas. And I think part of the answer here is just simply on the absolute scale of the incentive levels. I think what you'll find is that incentives up to a certain point, they certainly help the equation, but there is definitely a knee point at which, you know, you push folks into a zone where it just becomes very obvious to them that that upfront cost barrier is worth jumping over, thanks to the contribution of stacking incentives. So at $5,000, I think we have seen a bit of a bump of sales in Nova Scotia since the launch of the federal incentive. It's on the order of, I think, 200% last time I checked the increases year over year. But we think that this would probably be there'd be more of a pronounced effect if we weren't struggling with such a lack of availability. And part of that just has to do with momentum. You know, certainly the automakers might not have had advance notice that this incentive was coming down the pipeline. But certainly over time, we would hope that the market can respond a little bit better. And certainly if there were policies that actually required those automakers to stock EVs in greater numbers. But the last time we did a scan of availability, we found only 20 or so EVs available in dealerships in Nova Scotia. So that means A, it's hard to find one, and B, you just have a limited selection of models to choose from. So that would definitely dampen the impact of financial incentives.
Thank you for that, Jeff. Great. Next, we have a question from Tom McLean. He asks, what is the percentage of penetration of battery electric vehicles in Nova Scotia's light duty fleet versus that in Ontario, Quebec, and BC?
I'm happy to answer it. While Mo was presenting, I was able to anticipate these questions and do a little bit of digging first. So Electric Mobility Canada, as much as it's able to, has been reporting on EV sales across Canada. And it's clearly much lower. So the two different numbers you can talk about is percentage of new sales. And I think we mentioned right now Nova Scotia is at about 0.3% of new sales versus Quebec and BC, which are both above 5% market share. The last time we had comprehensive data. In terms of penetration into the actual market of the vehicles in circulation, Quebec and BC are both over 1% of the vehicles on the road, whereas Nova Scotia is down about 1/10 of that, so significantly further behind. If your question was about the split between BEVs versus PHEVs, it's roughly 50-50. I don't know the exact number, but as we've seen this, it's a pretty good split between those two technologies.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. The next question we have is from Johnny Beckett from the EV Network Inc. And he asks, are pre-owned battery electric vehicles part of this study or policy recommendations?
And yeah, so great question. And I think I know where this is coming from. Generally speaking, we have not considered pre-owned EVs in our modeling. And I think that's a fair assumption to make when we're dealing with a jurisdiction where there isn't an influx of secondhand EVs coming in from other markets. If we set that aside for the moment, our model doesn't really predict the degree to which, after a vehicle is first sold into the market, the degree to which it might change hands to different owners in the market. So I think that's fair if you make that assumption. But that said, I know there have been, probably as a result of the limited availability of EVs in traditional dealerships, I know that's led to sort of an influx of EVs coming in from other markets. So I think we may be missing that, especially as it relates to the more accessible price for those vehicles. But overall, I think so our focus here is on new vehicle sales, and yeah, it might be something for us to consider in the future as we see more of these efforts to import from other jurisdictions.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And we have a question from Michael. Why not forecast what's needed for 100% EV adoption by 2030? 30% adoption seems low to solve the current climate crisis.
I mean, that's a great question, and we've certainly done that in some cases. Sometimes we work with clients where they start with a target in mind, and we work backwards to see what would require. And that's not what we're doing here. I think, in my experience, achieving 100% adoption by 2030 it's possible in some leading jurisdictions, but I think for Nova Scotia, we haven't made the kind of headway that we would need to get there by then. In Quebec, that's on the limits of what's achievable based on the analysis we've done. We've done some modeling to look at some very aggressive policy, including even increasing incentives, introducing taxes on conventional vehicles, and massive deployment of charging infrastructure. And we see it being potentially possible to achieve 100% by 2030. But my professional judgment at this stage, without having done the numbers, it would be a real uphill battle to achieve that in a market like Nova Scotia that's just got a few other jurisdictions.
Cut out there at the end, but I think we understand. Thank you for that, Jeff. Yeah, no worries. you're kind of in the line of fire here, so appreciate you taking the time. We'll take a couple more questions before we end the session, but the next question is, do your models generally show an improving financial situation for electric utilities when you consider increased revenue from increased consumption versus cost of charging infrastructure? That's a great question from Tom McLean.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a topic that we've looked a lot at for a number of electric utilities, using our model to predict the impact of certain programs on EV adoption, and also looking at the impact of EV adoption on the grid. And what we found pretty consistently for a number of different utility clients is that the increase in revenue generated through electricity sales for charging, and charging that predominantly happens overnight when the grid has excess capacity, the increase in revenue attributable to that load growth is far greater than any additional costs required to serve that load on the grid. So any costs associated with maybe upgrades to handle higher peak loads from EV charging, and even in certain cases, any costs associated with the utilities' interventions in the market to go and deploy charging stations. So in other words, we found that things like fast charging stations can actually be a bit of a loss leader for utility companies. If they invest in that infrastructure, it may not be very profitable as a standalone investment, but it can lead to overall load growth, which can more than outweigh the costs of investing in those programs. And we're by no means the only consultants coming to that conclusion. We've seen that argument made in a lot of jurisdictions in the US. And in Canada, so far, Hydro-Quebec has made that argument to justify their investment in 1,600 fast chargers over the next 10 years.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Next, we have a question from John and Damien, and there was a few other comments in the chat just relative to the current coal mix and the current energy mix here in Nova Scotia. So I'll just ask John's question. As a potential EV purchaser, I am aware that a large percentage of electricity production in Nova Scotia is from coal. So that is a significant disincentive for me. I wonder whether it's worth it in terms of the environmental benefit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, this is something that we've looked at. I've been looking at that for most of my career. I first did that kind of a well-to-wheels analysis of EV charging during my master's at McGill in 2008 or so. And it's relatively accessible. The information about the emissions associated with electricity production is easily available. And so a lot of folks have done this kind of analysis on different grid mixes. In fact, there's a great tool from MIT called, I think it's carboncounter.com, that lets you look at the overall well-to-wheels emissions for a wide range of vehicle models on different grid mixes. And consistently what we find is that even in grids like Nova Scotia's today, EVs are a definite net benefit over the conventional gas car. But I think the more crucial detail is that the numbers get better over time. We know that the Nova Scotia grid is decarbonizing as we speak, making good progress on various forms of renewable energy. My overall comment on this is that electrifying transportation and decarbonizing electricity are two monumental tasks. They're going to take many years, more than a decade, and there's no reason that we should be pursuing these one after the other. We definitely want to pursue both in parallel, and if anything, the flexible load that an EV can provide to the grid can actually even be an enabler for a greater percentage of variable renewable generation, if we can take advantage of it through things like smart charging, so that EV charging can just sort of follow the availability of renewable generation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think the Ecology Action Center, through Stephen Thomas when he was with us, also did an electricity report that considers electric vehicle uptake in that report. So I encourage you to go to the EAC website and have a look at that as well. Okay, well, just ask one more question, and we have it from Angela, and it says, is it important to be considering which type of electric vehicle is being incentivized? It seems like battery electric vehicles would be more beneficial than a plug-in hybrid, but to a consumer, the plug-in hybrid might seem like the more attractive option due to worries over infrastructure and charging.
Mo, I feel like I've dominated the conversation so far. Why don't you take this one?
No worries. Yeah, I mean, I guess in the sense there that we've seen data showing that FEV owners sometimes use the electric motor use the electric side like 75% or 80% of the time. Like in terms of actual benefits, in terms of GHG reduction, there are still benefits, and some people want to have that safety net of having the gasoline as a backup in terms of they want to go on those long trips. So we definitely see it as see plug-in hybrids as something that's going to be with us for a bit at least. As that transition moves forward, but we also differentiate the incentive that is given for BEV and for FEV. So, and you can see that even with the current federal incentive with $5,000 for a BEV and $2,500 for a FEV, and then we kind of kept that in our modeling under the hypothetical provincial incentive as well. So we definitely think that that there's room for both in terms of increasing electrification for the light duty segment, but in terms of incentives, given that you kind of want to incentivize full-on electric more so, even if the cost eventually becomes cheaper for a BEV than a FEV, right?
Great. Okay, I'm going to throw one more at you just because I want to make sure everyone that came here and took the time to ask the question gets their question answered. So sorry, one more. It comes from Vincent, and I think it's relevant because he's talking about the similarities and differences between the status and challenges regarding EV adoption in other maritime provinces. So considering the relative geographical proximity, do you see some comparisons between the work that was done here and the other maritime provinces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think these markets are very closely linked. I think it's almost helpful for us that your neighbors just next door in New Brunswick. We've done a lot of work with NB Power over the years, and they've made similar investments in charging infrastructure, also with support from the federal government. Yeah, very similar story there, where we've got some actors in the market that are making significant investments in the space, but still being frustrated by a lack of availability of EVs in the market. And if anything, it's almost even worse in PEI and Newfoundland. I am seeing, just looking at the data, this February we did a scan, found 22 EVs available in dealerships in Nova Scotia, and only 4 in PEI and 8 in Newfoundland. So struggling with very similar issues, if in fact even more of a challenge there if you're interested in an EV, and you might have 4 models to choose from if you go to the right dealerships. So I think in certain cases, Newfoundland and PEI are even further behind on some of these challenges. They're only just now starting to install the type of charging infrastructure that's required, and even further behind on the availability front. But of course, yeah, all these jurisdictions are very closely linked. I'm certain that the lack of charging infrastructure in neighboring jurisdictions will have an impact on adoption in Nova Scotia as well. So really the region needs to move forward on this together. But I think fortunately we're finally starting to see some progress on a few different fronts, both in terms of charging and availability of EVs. But yeah, no, this is, and also I'll just, I'm based here in Quebec. I'll just say that I've been eager to make a road trip in my EV out to the East Coast again. And so, yeah, there are a lot of EV drivers in Quebec that are eager to come and visit you once the pandemic is over. And so we're going to be counting on ongoing investment in charging infrastructure to handle the influx of EV tourists from other jurisdictions.
Great, thanks for that. So we have a deadline. By the time Jeff gets here, we need excellent charging structure. That's great. Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour, and we've asked most of the questions you've posed. So I just wanted to send a big thank you out to Mo and to Jeff and to the team at Dunsky for your fabulous work on this report. Also to all of the stakeholders and all of you here today who have taken the time to listen to this report, and I hope the information presented will be useful for you in our joint effort at accelerating electric vehicle adoption moving forward. Finally, I wanted to thank Hope Perez, who is with the EAC, and she does all of the behind the scenes for the webinars to make sure that people's sound is on and we're not on mute and all the questions get answered. So a big thank you to Hope behind the scenes there. The report will be available publicly. It currently is posted on the Ecology Action Center's website, and we'll certainly be continuing to answer questions on this report moving forward. And we, again, thank you so much for your time here today, and feel free to get in touch if you have any further questions. Appreciate it, and enjoy your Friday afternoon. Thanks again, and we'll talk with you all soon.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks
Thank
for all the
you.
great questions.
Thanks, Kelsey. Thanks,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
Thank you, guys. See you later.